I'm going to do a video here on the tubeless conversion for RipCurrent S. And this isn't going to be a how-to video because Tim Combus, one of the members of the group, already did a two-part video. It's up on YouTube, and he did a great job on the actual process itself. However, when I went through the process after watching Tim's videos, I encountered quite a few challenges that Tim did not. And these challenges I don't think were really a function of anything that I did, so much as just things that could happen when the next person's coming along and doing it. And given that for Tim, his process worked well the first time, I didn't really have anything to refer to when I started running into some issues. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and do here in this video, is share with you some of the challenges that I had compared to Tim, who seemed to have much better karma than I did when he went and did his conversion. So ultimately, I have converted the rear wheel here on my RipCurrent to tubeless, and it's working. So this video is going to be based upon me working through the process on my front wheel, now that I kind of sort of know what I'm doing. But I am expecting and won't be surprised if I encounter some of the same challenges that I did last time. So let's get going and see what happens. So one area that I had to diverge a little bit from Tim was I wasn't entirely clear what he did for rim tape, because normally if you're going tubeless, you got to use a special rim tape, and that's to seal up all the holes on the rim for the spokes. And the trick here that you're going to encounter on a fat tire rim is the spokes are always going to be offset like this, but the distance between them is pretty great. When I went to Stan's website and even their Amazon page, the widest tubeless rim tape that I could find, I think, was 29, maybe 32 millimeters. That's not enough to cover this distance between the width of the offset here on these spokes. So the widest rim tape I could find was DT Swiss. This is actually 42 millimeters wide. And I'll kind of set it up here without actually doing the taping. You can see it actually is wide enough to cover both spokes, but it doesn't have much room on either side. So Tim had come up with a kind of ingenious solution. I'm not sure what he was actually using, but it kind of had a serpentine effect, and that gave him a wider margin on each side of the spoke holes, which I think is a good idea. I just wasn't sure what he was actually using, if he was actually using rim tape or if he was using the old, the original rim protector that came with it and somehow gluing that to the rim. I'm not quite sure what he was doing there. But the other thing that he did, which was brilliant, and I think this is actually what a fair number of people use when they're doing tubeless conversions for fat tire rims, is Gorilla Tape. And this stuff comes in different widths, of course, but the widest I think that you can find is this guy. I found it at the local hardware store. I think it was about, I don't know, 17 bucks. It was kind of crazy expensive. Probably could have bought it on Amazon for less, but I didn't feel like waiting. According to the packaging, it is 2.88 inches wide. And as Tim said, man, you set this in here, it's almost like it's made for this rim. It fits perfectly in there. So what I ended up doing was putting one wrap of this DT Swiss tubeless rim tape across it, knowing that it's probably just not enough coverage on the edges of these rim holes, and then came back around as Tim did and put a layer of the Gorilla Tape on top of that. So rather than make you watch me do that, I'm just going to do that myself and come back after I've completed that step. So this is where my experience started to differ significantly from Tim's, and not for the better on my end of the transaction. So this is looking at my rear tire that I've successfully converted to tubeless. So it's got air in it, it's seated properly on the rim, and you can see the gap, if you will, between the bottom of the yellow letters and the rim. So that's the spacing and what it looks like when it's properly installed. What I was encountering when I was going to try and inflate my tire after doing what Tim had done was this tire was so pliable, I'll say, even though it'd been on the rim for over a week with a tube in it to try and get shape, that the tire was folding back into the center of the rim to the point that you couldn't even see the bottom of these letters. So when I was trying to inflate the tubeless tire, all the air was just rushing between the tire and the rim, and there just wasn't anything I could do to kind of close that gap, if you will. I mean, I tried putting Gorilla Tape all the way around between the tire and the rim, and knowing that wasn't going to create a perfect seal, but hoping that it would at least create enough of a barrier for air escaping that when I put the air in with a compressor, it would force the tire against the rim. That didn't do it. So what I ended up having to do after all kinds of research and figuring things out is what Tim had done was he had put the rim tape followed by a wrap of Gorilla Tape on it, and then put the tire on, and he was good to go. I ended up having to put a couple more, maybe even 3 more wraps of Gorilla Tape around the entire rim. And by doing that, that prevented this tire, when deflated, from collapsing back to the center of the rim. So all of a sudden, these letters were a little bit more visible and, you know, bumping up against the edge of the rim, so that when I hit it with a compressor, the tire seated right away against the rim. Alright, so I thought I was going to get lucky, and I did not. I'm having the same problem I had with my other tire, which is, even though I'm using a automotive air compressor at about 100 psi, when I install or try to put air in this tire, it just is escaping around the tire, between the tire and the rim. So I'm going to have to do what I did last time. This time I'm going to be a little more conservative. I'm going to take the tire off, take the valve stem out, and put 1 more wrap of Gorilla Tape around the entire circumference of the rim, and then I'm going to try it again. Now when I do that, it's going to make it a little bit harder to get the tire back on because it's going to be a little bit tighter, but hopefully that'll also keep that tire from collapsing back against the center of the rim when I go to inflate it. Alright, so the good news is, after applying a second wrap of Gorilla Tape on the rim, on top of the DTS Swiss rim tape, the tire did seat properly on the rim. So that matches my experience with the rear tire that I did yesterday, in that it just needed a second wrap of Gorilla Tape in order for the tire not to be flopping around to the point that it doesn't seat on the rim. And again, I'm using an auto compressor, a compressor for an automobile with about 100 psi and a tank in it. So you're supposed to hit it with a big shot of air as opposed to, say, pumping it up with a floor pump or something. So that solved the problem. That was one of the things that I wanted to make sure people saw how I dealt with that, because that's probably a real-world experience for other people trying to go tubeless with this particular non-tubeless rim. So the next thing I'm going to do is, and understand I haven't put sealant in it yet, because I knew it was a possibility that the tire wasn't going to seat on the rim. And if you put sealant in the tire prior to that, and then you hit it with an inflator from your air compressor, and the tire doesn't seat on the rim, then your sealant's pretty much going to go everywhere, probably all over you. So that's the wet method, and probably why it's called the wet method. So the dry method is, you do what I did, you seat the tire on the rim with no sealant in it, and then you come back, you take the valve core out, pour the sealant through the valve core, put the valve core stem back in, pump it back up, and you're good to go, and you don't end up wearing sealant. So the next thing that I did, and probably isn't entirely necessary, but before I did that step with the sealant, I actually used some soapy water and put it all the way around the rim to see where I had leaks, if any. I also checked every single spoke to make sure I don't have air leaks around my spokes, because that would be a function of a bad tape job, and that would kind of undermine the whole point of the exercise. So you can't have air leaking from your spokes. You can, at this point with no sealant, have a little bit of leakage between the tire and the rim, and your sealant should probably solve that. It's also how I test how tight I have this nut on the valve stem, because it's just something you can do finger tight, but finger tight probably isn't going to be sufficient to keep it from leaking. So what I do is put a little bit of soapy water on it, take a pair of pliers, and then I keep tightening down that nut until it stops leaking, and that's how I know how tight to put that nut on the valve stem. So that'll be the next step, and we'll go from there. Alright, so here I got a leak, and it's just between the tire and the rim, and you can see it's just bubbling up there. Not real bad though, so I'm gonna hope that the sealant will take care of that. It should. But that's kind of what I'm looking for, is where I have obvious leaks, so that when I put the sealant in it, I can come back and double check. So it's like, okay, I'm on the side that says Minion, and I'm just to the left of where it says Minion, and I'll look there and make sure it's not leaking once I put sealant in it. Okay, so this is the other thing I ran into on my other rim, and you can see it happening on this one. I'm not sure you're going to be able to tell, but right here is the seam of the rim coming all the way across here, and you can see it's leaking there just a little bit. My other rim was leaking profusely on that seam, and that caused me a whole lot of consternation. I wasn't sure that the sealant would be able to handle that. I went down and talked to my local bike store. They said they've encountered that even on rims that are designated as tubeless, and they've had to send them back to the manufacturer and as a defect and get another rim. But fact of the matter is, these are not tubeless ready rims. So I've actually talked to Juice Technical Support. They were very, very helpful and supportive, and had some positive suggestions, as opposed to basically saying it's a stupid idea because you're using rims that are not rated for tubeless. What they basically suggested was, hey, if it's not leaking real bad, which this isn't, I mean, it's leaking, but it's not catastrophic. I mean, you wouldn't want to live with that. They basically said, hey, go ahead, put your sealant in and see what happens. I mean, the worst case at this stage is the sealant doesn't fix the leak, and you got to take the tire off, and you got a mess on your hands. And you know, if that's the worst of it, I guess that's the worst of it. That wouldn't be ideal, but not the end of the world. So this was the other thing I just kind of wanted to share with folks, because I think this would be a fairly common thing to experience when you're trying to convert a non-tubeless rated rim to a tubeless setup. So at this point, I've identified most of the major leaks. Looks like I got another one right here on this side of the tire as well. So I got a couple of leaks where the tire's meeting the rim, and then I got the other leak down here on the seam, or the weld of the rim. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the sealant and hope it works. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take the valve core stem out, which is up here. So I'll take the valve core stem out, and then I'll pour the sealant in. In this case, I'm using Stands. Seems to be varying opinions as to what the best one is. Slime seems to be consistently rated number 3. My local bike store says Stands is the best, but the guy I talked to at Juice said that a lot of professional mountain bikers are using Orange. I don't really have strong feelings about one versus the other. I haven't used Orange, but I did use Stands on my other tire, and that took care of the leaks
that I experienced on that one, which are similar to the leaks I'm experiencing on this one. So I'm going to do that next and then come back and check for more leaks. Alright, so not a lot of happiness. I think it's kind of hard to tell. This is my seam here. Yeah, I still have a little tiny leak. You can see a bubble forming there. So that's not good. Moved off there. Put it a little bit lower there and see what happens. So yeah, another bubble just formed. So it's not leaking a lot, but it does have a small little leak still on that seam. See what happens here. So yeah, you can see a couple little bubbles forming there, not very quickly. So I think what I'm going to do is going to put a little more sealant in the tire, swish it around a little bit more, and try and do my best to get the sealant down here in this part of the tire and pump it up again. At this point I've checked all the spokes. The sealant took care of the leaks that I had over here between the tire and the rim, so those are good. So at this point, that's the only thing I'm fighting against. It's a tiny little leak. I could probably ride with it, but I'd have to reinflate my tire every time I went somewhere, which that would kind of suck. So I'm going to put a little bit more sealant in and then give it another shot. And before I forget, I think Rick Rowan and some other people in the group suggested these portable little air compressors. Oh, these things are wonderful. When you put them on, you turn them on, you program it by hitting these two little buttons here at the same time and holding it. So you can see it's flashing 27, so I programmed it to 27 psi. You turn it, you connect it to your Schrader valve, you turn it on, and it runs until it hits 27 psi, and then it automatically turns off. So it's kind of a godsend. I'm not living in Phoenix like some people on this group, but I do live in Central California where it's about 95 today, which makes it about 105 in my garage. And grunting over an air pump, a floor pump, isn't a whole lot of fun. So I do recommend these little portable compressors. They're about 50 bucks on Amazon, but it takes a long time to pump up these 4-inch fat tires. Alright, at this point, I'm not entirely convinced that it sealed the leak on the seam of the rim. Sometimes when I'm putting water on it, it bubbles. Sometimes it does not. So put some extra sealant in it, swished it around like you're supposed to, re-inflated it, which, by the way, it's kind of a messy process. Kind of got to be ready for a volcano to blow when you take the valve core stem out to put some more sealant in. Unfortunately, I'm not wearing any of it, but that's mostly good luck more than anything. So at this point I'm going to let it sit for a few hours and hope that the sealant does its thing. The leak, if it's there, is just tiny. I might be able to live with it. I'm not real happy about it, but I'm not sure what else to do at this point. But that was the point of the video. These are, I think, some real-world challenges that go with converting to tubeless when you're using rims that are not rated as tubeless ready, which is the case with the RipCurrent S. I don't know about the other juice bike models, but I suspect that's probably the same situation. So anyhow, that's the video. Hope that's of help to somebody, anybody out there who's considering going with tubeless. And if you've got any questions, let me know. Thanks. Alright, so it's tomorrow, and had a little concern when I got up this morning and checked my front tire to see how it was doing on air pressure. It had dropped 1 psi, which I was hoping wasn't going to be a big deal. I was attributing that to a 30-degree
drop in the ambient temperature. Turned out when I got done doing this yesterday, it was about 98 degrees. And it was probably about 68 degrees when I woke up this morning. So 30-degree drop in temperature, and that certainly is enough to make a difference in the tire pressure. As it gets warmer, all things being equal, your tire pressure goes up. It gets colder, tire pressure will drop a little bit. Not dramatically, but that's true for automobiles as well as bicycles. So decided to trust it. Just got back from a 20-mile ride. I don't know, it's cooled off quite a bit today, so it's probably only about 90 or 92 right now. But all 20 miles was on hot pavement and riding fairly hard, not super hard, but probably averaged over 20 miles an hour. And just got home and checked the pressure in both tires, and my rear's at 27 and my front's at 28, which I would expect a little bit of bump in pressure because of the ambient temperature and also being on the hot pavement. So I'm going to call this good and say that I have successfully converted my RipCurrent S to tubeless, and now all I got left in front of me is converting my wife's RipCurrent S to tubeless. Not that I have any pressure associated with that small task, but that's kind of the way it goes. So one question people might have, simple question if you haven't done this before, would be, why are you even going through the process? I mean, you know, it looks like a lot of hassle. Why would you do it? And I would say primarily because the reality is we're getting older, which is part of the reason why we went to e-bikes versus our old traditional road bikes. Is we used to do a lot of self-contained touring, done a little bit of racing and this, that, and the other thing. So long-time cyclists, but as we get older and the list of maladies gets longer and longer, riding the old traditional road bikes is a little bit harder, and these e-bikes are just plain fun. But the e-bikes are a lot harder to change tires on, especially as we get older. If nothing else, these things weigh probably 3 times what the traditional bike weighs. So it's just a lot harder to wrestle with on the side of the road when you get a flat tire. The other harsh reality is, you know, in my wife's case, she's developing some arthritis in her hands. And so it's just tough for her to change a tire at this point. It's not to say she can't do it, but it's hard. And that really limits what she's able to do as a cyclist. We had e-bikes before these RipCurrents, and in some ways they were as challenging as the RipCurrent to change tires, because it's a mid-drive motor, but it's on a belt to a differential hub on the rear wheel. So you got a chain on one side, a belt on the other side, so changing the rear tire, which is almost always the tire that gets a flat just because of all the weight on the rear of the bike compared to the front, it's just hard. And so that meant that for my wife anyhow, she's somewhat tethered to me in the sense that she either rides when I'm riding with her, or she rides when she knows I'm a phone call away. And that's all well and good on my side of the equation, but it certainly restricts her ability to go out and ride, and she's an accomplished cyclist, and there's no reason she shouldn't be able to do that. So all things being equal, the theory is you get less flats on tubeless. You know, you're not going to get a pinch. Honestly, a lot of the flats I was getting on my other e-bike were on the rear tire, and oftentimes it was just the seam of the tube splitting. And that's what happened the last time I rode it, right before the RipCurrents came a couple, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago. Just hit a bump. It wasn't even a pothole. It was just kind of a rough road, and seam on that rear tube just split about 4 inches long, and you know, there's no amount of sealant that's going to fix that. So that kept happening, and with tubeless, you know, that problem goes away. I mean, you're still subject to picking up thorns, but the sealant should seal that. About the only thing you're really probably going to have a problem with is if you pick up a really large object, you know, a piece of metal or something like I did a couple of weeks ago that completely shredded my tire. But even a nail, you get those plug kits, tubeless plug kits like a Dynaplug, you should be able to fix those on the side of the road without taking your tire off the wheel or your wheel off the bike. So that's kind of the why, and I think that's about it. I mean, that's enough for us. Hopefully I don't regret all this. So far I do not. Like the way it felt when I was writing today. And we'll see how it goes from here. Again, this wasn't a lot of how-to and showing you how to do the conversion, but if you have questions, feel free to ask. I've done 2 tires now, and I got 2 more to do in the next week or so. So if you have any questions, hey, fire away and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks.